Good morning. So in continuing Shiurim Kala Asik B'Teres, I guess Milchama. So through Teda we can accomplish, at least in the root source, a tikkun that helps the battles on the ground. So let me continue the story. And as I pointed out in the previous classes, when you push to live with the times, lamed the Zeit with the parshas, it's literally exactly the events of our time. And I don't say that my own chiddush. That's basically when you look at my Maimonides Chazal, and especially as I indicated different Maimorim and answers from the Rabbeim, including the Rebbe, whether it was the Yalkut Shmeini the Rebbe used in Tafshin Nun Aleph regarding the Iraq War. It was very clear that Rebbe was using these Melech Poras, Melech Harvi. So even though a few people have pointed out, and I think I mentioned it as well, there are ha'aras from the Rebbe that Bnei Ishmael today are not necessarily exactly these countries, because Sancherev, Bilbil, Sa'el, Bilbil, Sancherev, but nevertheless, just like Malchus Edim, who's exactly Malchus Edim? Is it the Russians? Is it the Europeans? Is it the United States? Bottom line is, generally, the ancestors of all the Western world is more or less Rome and Europe. And the ancestors, more or less, of the Middle East is the Bnei Ishmael, except there was plenty of Bilbulim. So you can't trace, like by us, you can trace Yichus, you're Ben, all the way back to Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. I don't think you can do that with most of the Ummah Sa'elim. But the general regions, absolutely. That's why the Rebbe used the Medrash. If you say Bilbil Ha'elim, how could the Rebbe use the Medrash of Yalkut Shmeini about Melech Poras, Melech Arvi? That's talking about back a few thousand years ago. So bottom line is that when Kabbalah and in the Chazal, I should say, Kabbalah and Chassidus talk about Birur, that the end of Golus will be the Birur of Ishmael and Edom, we're talking about basically these battles. It's usually understood as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, if you can put them all. And basically it's Bnei Ishmael, Bnei Esav, and Bnei Yisrael, in Yaakov and Yitzchak. Especially, just to go a step further, the Abarbanel, who lived after Sancherev, he clearly in his Sforim, especially on his Mefarshim on Daniel and in other Sforim of his, and he lived in time in Sfard, in the gate of Sfard, he lived basically 700 years ago. He clearly says that all these battles are directly connected to the Psukim here, and he refers to them, and so a lot of what I'm saying is taken from these sources. But the real, I'm not here just to talk about Abarbanel, because the Rebbe's Tzetlach, I mentioned the note from the Rebbe to Rabbi Greenglass, which I think is a very, revelation of the Rebbe's look at the whole situation, and the Maimorim I mentioned. So that's why it's not a stretch to say that the parshas that talk about Ishmael and Yitzchak and then Yaakov and Esav, you can directly talk about our time. Yaakov and Esav, the Rebbe Beferish speaks about. The Birur of Esav is, the Rebbe says in the Sichos, Vayeshev Nun Beis, and many Sichos, that it's Esav is Edom, which is Tzarfas, and America. He talks about the Western world. So generally speaking, that's why you could say this. I'm just pointing out this issue. So it's not about directly, yes, there's no question there's some countries in the Middle East that actually are traced to completely different roots in Asian and another ancestry. Okay, there's just a ha'ara agav in this conversation. But getting back to the actual topic at hand, regardless, we have Teda Meloshin Hera. So what do you have at the end of this week's Parsha Chai Sarah? So though the Parsha is called Chai Sarah, it's all about Sarah, and then about Avram burying Sarah, and then about the search for a Shidduch for Yitzchak. But then, interestingly, end of the Parsha, reappearance of Ishmael. So first of all, when Avram passes away, so Ishmael returns, and in him it says, "V'yikbru Eisi Yitzchak v'Yishmael bonov el Moras HaMachpelah." And Zashi says, from here we know that Yishmael did tshuva, because it says first Yitzchak and then Yishmael. And then not some once, there you could say it's connected to the Kfura of Avram. But then comes Ve'ela Telis Ishmael ben Avram, the end of the parsha right here about Ishmael and his children as grandchildren. So the Mefarshim obviously asked this question, like, why suddenly are we talking about Ishmael? Is this Tama Derech Hagav? Maimon Amuzgar, so to speak, since you're already mentioning him now, Ishmael passes away at 137, etc., etc. So, the Baal HaTurim says right here, Veloshen Belushenei, he says, Al Pnei Kol Echov Nofal. That's the end of the parsha. Vayishkenu Mechavil Ashur. It says where Ishmael lived. Asher Al Pnei Mitzrayim. Ba'acha Ashura Al Pnei Kol Echov Nofal. Says the Baal HaTurim. So since V'nismach La Ve'ela Tel Dis Yitzchak, because when you read the next pasuk in the next parsha, so Ela Tel Dis Ishmael, then goes back to Ela Tel Dis Yitzchak. So there's clearly a juxtaposition, a correlation between the two. So he says V'nismach La Ve'ela Tel Dis Yitzchak Leimer Kishiyipel Yishmael Ba'achlis Hayomim Oz Yitzchak Oz Yitzmach ben David Shu Metel Dis Yitzchak. So he clearly is talking about the Baal HaTurim, the Ba'achas HaYomim, there will be a battle, and that will be the time when Yipel Yishmael, Ba'achas HaYomim, and then Yitzmach will blossom, Mashiach, basically. Yitzmach ben David, who comes from Teldas Yitzchak. I mean, it's as clear as day what he's talking about here. He's not talking about Bismaneh, he's talking about today. As a matter of fact, in the Rashi, in the Pasha Vayera, when it says, Basher Husham, and the Eibishter says, I will bless him Basher Husham, Ishmael. So the Malachim, they came with a taina. We know what Ishmael is going to do later by Bovel. Deprive the Eden from water. The whole Rashi, one of the longest Rashis that you find. That answers the whole history. And the Eibishter says, the answer is Basher Husham. Right now, he's getting schar for where he is now. We're not talking about what's going to happen in the future. But you see from all this that the future is very clear. Yishmael itself, the name, I think I mentioned from Medrash, is Meloshet Osid, Yishma Kel. So Medrash says, because Ba'achlis HaYomim, when the Eden and the world will cry out what Yishmael does, so Yishma Kel, his name itself is Shivrei B'tzidei. In Yishmael's name itself, that the Eibishter had, the Eibishter will listen to the prayers, not of Yishmael. Initially it's about Yishmael crying and Hagar, but it will be the cries at the end of days. So all this are part of the Midrashim that unfold and you see, reveal a deeper narrative here. Now the Baal HaTurim, it's not his Chiddush that there'll be something Ba'achas HaYomim. I mentioned, and I'll elaborate a little more last time, I'll just repeat the answer for the Rebbe to Rabbi Greenglass. So in Matzah, I mentioned I think the wrong year, I said Lamed Zayin, Lamed Ches, I'm sorry. It's Tafresh Mem. And the Maimer called Matzah Zu, Hemshech Matzah Zu from the Rebbe Marash, Tafresh Mem, basically 1880. The Rebbe Marash says the following, that Avram was mispalel on Yishmael. Lu yicha Yishmael lefanecha, he mentions. Af shebevada yoda Avram Mahusei he says two Lashanas there, I forgot the Mahusei and some another Lashon. He knew the Mahusei of Yishmael. Umashiyase ba'achlis hayomim, that's what the Rebbe Marash writes. Still he was mispalel for Yishmael. So Rabbi Greenglass wrote to the Rebbe, I'm not sure what year, from the Ksav Yad of the Rebbe, it's mashmeh around Tov Mem. So it'd be basically 100 years later, 1980. And Rabbi Greenglass asked the Rebbe, writes to the Rebbe, maybe this is Lahoyer from Zoyar Seif Parsha Va'era, where there it talks that Yishmael will have a Melchama, will make a Melchama gegen the Welt, he'll attack Edom, and then he'll attack Israel, that's Israel, and then will be Mashiach will come. Which basically, Baal HaTurim says, not all that Lashanis, Baal HaTurim is not mentioned in this settle. And the Rebbe writes, that's Seif Parsha Va'era. And the Rebbe writes, this is the Rebbe's Ksav Yad, Umezer Chali Gimel Seif Parsha Balak, and then the Rebbe writes, Piyut, Yisrael Nesha, and through the Slichas, where we say Kilo Seir v'Chesnei. Seir goes on Edom, Esav, and Chesnei is his father-in-law. So it's like a remez, so that they'll be eliminated. V'Oid, the Rebbe adds. So you look there, all these places is all talking about Milchamas ba'achris hayamim, literally what the Baal HaTurim says. And at the end of the day will be the Nitzach, and this is all in order to lead. It says clearly, Yitzmach ben David. Now, Kimuvin, we all pray that this should be with a minimal amount of pain, a minimal amount of war, but it's not a pella when you start seeing these battles. So when the Rebbe brought the Yalkut Shmeini in Tovshin Nun Aleph, I remember how exactly the first Rabbein when the Rebbe mentioned it. I think someone actually hung up the Yalkut Shmeini on the wall in 770. If I recall correctly, the Rebbe actually stopped and looked at it. So I'm not saying that was what was made of the Rebbe, but I think it was Rabbi Olav Hashem Yisvitzer Kazen was the one who hung it up. If I recall, maybe wrong, I think he was the one. And I remember the Rebbe walked in 770, I wasn't there, but I heard later the Rebbe stopped and looked at it. Now I'm sure the Rebbe knows the Yalkut Shmeini, but whatever is the Sibur, at that time the Rebbe began speaking the Yalkut Shmeini. So I remember right away, by Chazorah and other, we started talking about it. It wasn't every day that Rebbe brought a medrash, especially such a dramatic medrash. You all know the medrash. The medrash says that Yamid Melech Poras Keneged Melech Arvi. This is when Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait, and the whole war broke out. So Yamid Melech Poras Keneged Melech Arvi, and the whole world will make a whole tumult. Everybody will run around. So tumult was Zayin. Ubnei Yisrael will also be confused. And then the Eibishter will say, Bonai lo yiro, don't be afraid. Kol ma shasisi asisi b'shvilchem. Everything I did, the Eibishter says, I did for you. Higia zman gulaschem. That's when the Rebbe started using that lashon. That's I think the same Yalkut also says Yamid Melech Mashiach Gag Beis Hamikdash. Is that the same medrash? I think so. Yeah. So I remember someone asking me then, not from someone I mentioned in a talk I gave, I think. So someone said that Rebbe took a medrash, like you know what? So that's when I was researching it, and I realized the medrash is just a tip of the iceberg. When you start looking at these zehars and this Baal HaTurim and so much more, you see it's not that Rebbe just found a medrash Melech Poras. It indicates at the end of days there will be these battles. And by the Rebbe's clearly he gives mangul aschem. You could say the Baal HaTurim, at least, and not directly, but maybe one of his Makedas is the Yalkut Shmeini, because that's what it says. They'll first be Ishmael, they will attack, them Nofal, Kishanofal, that's when it'll be, till this Yitzchak will be Yitzmach ben David. So, you see, when you start looking back, the plot. Now, of course, you could ask the immediate question, I'll just stop and just ask this question, so why? The Rebbe said it back in Tovshin Nun Aleph. Now we're talking about 33 years later. So why didn't the Gula just come then? So I don't have an answer to this question. The Rebbe himself said many times, Chabtaka Kasha. It could very well be that Rebbe wanted and the Rebbe was pushing and doing everything possible that should be the last Milchama, and that would be over. The Yalkut Shmeini would be Mekuyim, Mashiach would come, Yigiz Mangolaschim again. Meizah Sibba, whether it's because we didn't do our job, I'm not going to start pointing fingers at myself or anybody else. Meizah Sibba was still not in that place. So it's another Milchama? The Milchama is real. So what can I tell you? No, Chaz v'Shara Einish, it means clearly that this last birur with Yishmael is not finished. It's not a stira. It gives mangul aschem. It's still the end of the story. Exactly. That's the Rebbe Shitta was always finished till the end. Emo for Alamo, that's for sure. Yeah. But I'm saying, I'm not justifying. We all wish this didn't happen. But once it happens, you start looking at the story. So first Torah for sure is clearly, Yisrael Botach B'Hashem, we have a Eibishter, and it says, in the Kavana, what it says here, Yitzmach ben David, and Mashiach will come, the Geula, and all this will be a distant memory. But at the same time, we also have to learn from this what we have to do. Because here, the obvious question is, Yishmael did do tshuva. So are his grandchildren also going to do tshuva? That's what the hope is. And it's interesting also, this all comes at the end of Parsha Chai Sarah. So let's talk about that a bit more. Now, Sarah was actually not the mother of Yishmael, and if anything, she banished Yishmael. She's the one that insisted that Yishmael be sent away. Because Mitzachik, Rashi teaches all the three opinions, all the Gimel Dvarim, Yarik Val Yaver, Avedis Alilim, Avedis Zara, Gilead Ayis, the Tzicha. And that's why they have to send her. She insisted, and Avram didn't want to. He had sad over it, and the Eibishter told. Why? Because it's still his son. Ishmael has DNA from Avram Avinu, Hagarech, but Avram. And so, but the Eibishter told him, you have to listen to Sarah. Now, was Sarah stam because it wasn't her son, so she didn't have Rachmanas and Ishmael? Chaz v'sholom. She knew. She was a Neviah, she was a prophetess, and she knew that Siddat Tzoros, and this Adarabah, sending away Yishmael was not an act of Stam D'chiyah. It was, you see then he does tshuva. So what do you learn the first thing from this? That sometimes discipline with someone that needs discipline is actually L'teva son. It was L'tevas Yishmael, not just L'tevas Yitzchak. So when the Rebbe says, for example, that you have to go all the way to the end by the Yom Kippur War into Damascus, into Cairo. So some people misinterpret that the Rebbe is a hawk. He's a right-wing chaz v'sholem. Because it's the exact opposite. If it's an enemy, you have to destroy the enemy completely, and then you can have peace. And if you need a raya, look at World War II. Germany and Japan were quite terrible. And America and the Allies had to insist on unconditional surrender, not conditional surrender. And many people died, and many civilians died. But what did that ultimately create? Peace. Till this day, Japan, Germany were rebuilt by America, and they're at peace. They're allies now with the United States and with Israel. So what do you see? That sometimes Gvura actually makes the chesed stronger. Because V'shavto ha'eda v'yitzilo ha'eda. Sarah's wisdom was understanding that Yishmael's taka chesed, in the language of Chassidus, chesed of Avram, but chesed the klippah, too much chesed, and you need Gvura. Yitzchak is pachad Yitzchak Gvura. He's the heir, the Yerish of Avram, because you need chesed Gvura balance, and then Tiferes of Yaakov. And I'm using the Mamorim that explain this. And Yishmael was chesed ulumah. And the only way to deal with that is you have to have a strong Gvura, which was to send them away. And look at the end of the story. It wasn't Merachakim. He ended up coming back and recognizing that Yitzchak comes before Yishmael, and ends up clearly, it says he did tshuva. That means Avram's genes at the end of the day did dominate, did have an effect on him. So we have to believe that all the tzeitzoim of Yishmael, just like the tzeitzoim of Esav, will ultimately come around. And if you look, the sikha I mentioned again, which is I believe one of the most yesodistic sikhas of the Rebbe, if you want to understand the whole historical panorama, is by Yeshiv Nun Beis. Just Bekitza, the sikha, just chazer over the Kudus, where the Rebbe says there that the Alter Rebbe was menagid to Tzarfas winning the war against Russia, in the Russo-Franco War. Ad Kadei Kach, Chassidim say, even the Rabbeim I think say that as a result of that, the Alter Rebbe passed away before his time. It was Mesa Nefesh. That Rosh Hashanah, he woke up early, blew shofar early in the morning, to make sure that Russia win. Now Alexander wasn't exactly a Eiv Yisrael. He was at Seder, he was a Russia, Merusha. But the Alter Rebbe, in the big picture, saw that for Eden, it's better that Gashmis may not be so easy, but Baruchnis will be better. Whereas Napoleon was promising freedom, but a godless freedom, but Alter Rebbe was worse than godly oppression, if you wish. Not that bottom line was, that's what the Rebbe said. But here's the big chiddush. Only time the Rebbe ever said such a thing. The Rebbe said that was then. But now 7 generations later, we already were mavaded enough, and we grew up. Because what does it say by Yaakov and Esav? It says that when Esav says to Yaakov in Pasha Vayishlach, he says to him, come, Ovei Ali, and let's live side by side. Come live in Eden, near Eden. And Yaakov says, Visnala li'iti, that saying Rakes, the children are young, that saying the sheep are tender, we're not mature enough to come live near you. But Rashi says, so what? He's again deceiving Esav. He knows he wasn't going. Why did he give this excuse? So Rashi says, no. He will end up going. When Mashiach comes, Yaakov will ultimately meet with Esav again. Chassidus explains, the Rebbe explains, in that Sikha, Yaakov was saying, I thought that you were first ready for Mashiach. You're not ready, so I'm not ready yet to engage with Esav. And the Rebbe said that's essentially what the Alter Rebbe was saying. Esav is the Western world. We're not ready to engage with the Western world. It's too complex, it's too difficult. The Eden were not strong enough. But the Rebbe says 7 generations later, now we can go to Tzarfas and to the Western world. Now we have the Keches, and the Rebbe brings that the Rebbeim sent people to Tzarfas. It was Meramez also to himself and the Rebbetzin. And we could be Mevarer. That's what the Rebbe said. Ad Kedei Kach, the Rebbe went, and that in Tovshin Lamed Daled, Chassidim, obviously the Rebbe was the one that did it, said they took the anthem, the national anthem of Tzarfas, of France, and turned it into Haderes V'Amunah L'Chai Elamim. The anthem represented the aggression and the power, Keich V'Eitzim Yodeh of Tzarfas, that the Alter Rebbe was so against, and the Mittler Rebbe and Alter Rebbe both have long letters where they explain why they're against Tzarfas. They call him, they mentioned Napoleon, Bonaparte they mentioned. And the Rebbe said, but that's why Chassidim took the Nigun, the very Nigun of the Nitzachim of France, and turned it into Kedusha. And then the Rebbe went on and said that the Nigun there afterwards, it actually weakened the Nigun, that they changed some of the Tenuas and some of the song and some of the language. It's a very aggressive song. So I remember I prepared that sikha for the Rebbe, and I'm saying, like, this is, big statements. The Rebbe is saying that the world changed. I'll come back to the point in a moment. Let me just share with you what happened. So I wrote so when we were preparing the sikha, the Rebbe always wanted us to make sure everything is exactly b'diuk. So I called Shmuel Azimov in Paris to ask him if he could check out in French history, French newspapers, about what exactly happened with the change. Not that I was questioning that it changed. The Rebbe said, but I want to know the details. So when you write it very accurately. So he sent me back 3 or 4 clips from French newspapers that Takin Tovshin Lamed Hey, I think, or Lamed Vov. Right a year or 2 later, the next president of France came in, and they changed they said the song was a very aggressive song, like calling for blood. It's a song of victory that when Napoleon won the war, etc. And they indeed changed things. But then the next president came in, I think in Lamed Vov, in 76 or something like that, 77, and he changed it back. So the French anthem is back the way it was originally, but there was a change for a period of time. So I decided, you know what, let me send all this to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe told us what to do. So I sent in the clips, the French newspaper clips that came by fax, with a zettel, and I wrote that the Rebbe said so and so. We mavared exactly the details, and we're asking the Rebbe how to write it. So the Rebbe wrote back that you should write exactly what happened. Say it was nishtana, and then it was changed back. So it's all in Ha'ara. You'll see it all in the Sikha there. There's a footnote, and then the Rebbe wrote to us. The Rebbe wrote that bevadei yichadoshes piderech hateva. I think the Rebbe wrote. In other words, the story's not over yet. There'll be chadoshes. Aval inyanam is lei lechapish or lei lirdef acher chadoshes. Basically, I guess because we sent in newspaper clips, the Rebbe was telling us our job is not to follow the media, but to write sikhs. The Rebbe didn't say those words, but I'm saying, he said, our job is not to follow the news, which I took to heart, obviously. I can't say I would do it perfectly. It's hard not to follow some of the news today. But I always keep my eyes open for this story to happen, that in France they'll change it back. It hasn't happened yet. But my point is that so it's all in the Sikha there. You can look it up. It's in the Sefer HaSichos, Tavshinun Beis, Mugeh, Vayeshev. So what do you see from this? You see from this that with time passes, things change. Now, let's take it back to Yishmael. We haven't reached yet the story of Yaakov and Esau. That's next week's parsha. So you go back to Yishmael, you see that there is a birur. Yishmael began as who he was, Pera Adam, and then he did Shuvah. And that's exactly what you say, Yitzmach, based Yitzmach ben David. It doesn't mean that Yishmael Nafal will destroy the negative part. But just like Yishmael did Shuvah, you have to say there'll be the birur of Bnei Yishmael, just like there was the birur of Bnei Esav. And you can see, through the history, Bnei Esav create many, many problems for Eden, probably more than anybody in history. We're talking about the Romans destroying the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, so that wasn't that Christianity, but it was Rome. Remi, Magdiel Zu Remi, that's a grandson of Esav. And then all the other tzaras that we suffered under their hands. Basically, Golus Eden, the worst tzaras in Europe. Some people even say the Holocaust is a result of Christian discrimination, even though the Nazis were not exactly religious. But they used it. They used the anti-Semitism of the West of those countries against the Eden, obviously. So and yet you still have a country like the United States, was born from Christians, not from Jews, that has been a haven that protected Eden, and the Rebbe said many times, a malchus shel chesed, coming from Bnei Esav. So you see the end of the story is a positive one, that ultimately the bitter will happen, as the Rebbe explains in Vayeshev Nun Beis. And you have to say the same thing with Ishmael, essentially what the Balaturim says, the Zoyas I just mentioned. So we're like, you could say, I mean, I can't say what the Rebbe would say exactly today, but I have no doubt it would be in that kav, that this is like that's the last thing, because right after this will be the Tzmichas ben David, like the words of the Balaturim, the words of the Zoyar, the Midrashim I mentioned, the Gizman Gulaschim, I mean, again, more and more. I want to add one more thing. I think I may have mentioned it last time, but maybe not. So the plot thickens. The Barbanel says it's bad enough that we have to be involved with Bnei Esav and Bnei Ishmael. And as I also pointed out, the Gemara and the Medrash that talk about by Matan Torah, what did the Eibishter do? He offered the Torah to Bnei Esav and Bnei Ishmael. So there again you see, they suddenly reappear. Because they're children of Avram at the end of the day. And ultimately, the message of Torah, Sheb Mrs. Bnei Nech, is going to affect them too. And it would affect them. The Rambam says clear that Islam, Christianity and Islam, both are the Asher Saderech for Mashiach, more than it was before, with all their flaws. So you see that they're pretty prominent. So the Barbar Brunel, when he talks about it, he brings a medrash. It's not a medrash that is very popular. It's a medrash that's brought in Torah Shlema. It's one of these medrashim that are not in the regular medrashim. A medrash that talks about the chasana of Esav. Remember I mentioned before, and I'm being Hidaik now, the Rebbe mentioned in Slichas, Yisrael Nesha, that's Kila Seir V'Chesnei. So what is that talking about? Seir V'Chesnei. Esav and his father-in-law. So when Esav heard how Yitzchak and Rivka told Yaakov at the end of Parsha Vayetze, at the end of Parsha's Teldus, next week's Parsha. So what did he tell them? He told Yaakov to go find a shidduch back in Padana, in the place where of the family of their family of Avram. The exact lashon was the lashon. So Esav heard that. So he also Lech Padana Arom Beisa B'sul Avi Imech. Yeah. Kach Lacham Misham Ishmael Bnei Slov and Achi Imech. Basically, he takes a woman from that family. That's what they were like, just like Rivka. Avram sent Eliezer, Eved Avram, to go find a shidduch there. So same thing, Yaakov. When Esav heard that, so we know, Vayelech Esav El Yishmael, Vayikach Es Machlas Bas Yishmael Ben Avram, Aches Nevius Al Noshav Leila Isha. Because Esav heard, that's the preference. But what happens? This wedding. What happens with this wedding? It's not so simple. Later, it says later that Esav, and later in Parsha Vayishlach, it talks that Esav took Bosmas. So Rashi says there, and all the Mefarshim say, Bosmas is the same person as Machlas. So why is there two different names? So the answer is, so the Medrash says like this. Esav, Taka took her, they were engaged. Came the wedding day. The wedding day, so of course there's negotiations between the Shver and the Eidim. You know, as they say, why is he called a Shver and he's called Eidim? Because after the marriage, there's always an argument for the dowry, as they call it, for the, what do they call it, Naden, and the newlywed. The chassan says to the Shver, you promised me so much and so much. So the Shver says to him, bring Eidim. That's why I call him an Eidim. And I didn't promise you that. I promised you much less. So the Eidim says to the Shver, Shver, made the b'mix, it's chayav b'shvua. That's why they say it's called Shver Eidim. So if you ever have issues with your shver, you can always cite that. So that's taka what happened. The day of the wedding, they're sitting and they're negotiating. And listen to this. Ishmael comes up with, Esav comes up with a brilliant idea. He was a smart man. He says to Ishmael, between us, let's make a deal. You kill your brother, Yitzchak. You always wanted to kill him. So you kill him. I'll kill my brother Yaakov. And then we'll be left the sole heirs, Yorshim, of Avram's great wealth. Avram was very wealthy. And we don't have to share it with our brothers. So the Medrash says that Ishmael, who's not a fool himself, is also a smart man, says to Esav, Haloi Kain anechi. You think I'm Kain, who's going to go kill my brother? And I know what you're going to do next. Since you're a Ish Halacha, and you know Adin, then you'll have the mitzvah of Geil Adam, because I killed your father, Yitzchak. So you'll come and kill me with the same cheshbon. Then you'll be the only Yerush. So I would have killed Yitzchak, you would have killed Yaakov, then you kill me, and you're left with all the money. I'm not making such a deal. I'm not joking. This is a real medrash. That Bar Benel, I found the medrash of that Bar Benel, and I started looking. Yeah, it's a medrash. So therefore, Ishmael basically said to him, no. So Esav said, that's the case. I'm out of here. I'm not marrying your daughter. That's what happened. That's why later he comes back, after Ishmael dies, Esav comes back and marries her. And that's why she's named another name. It's like a second engagement, if you wish. So the Abarbanel writes these words. I don't remember the exact lashon, very sharp lashon. He writes that most of the tzaddis we're having is not just from Bnei Esav and Bnei Ishmael. It's from this ill-fated chasana. Because now what you have is worse. It's not just Ishmael and Esav. Both of them now married. So you can imagine now you have the tzaddis from Beidazite. Yishmael's problems and Esav's problems. I remember I wrote about this. It was actually someone picked up, it was printed in a major newspaper. So I wrote that when America is making deals with Arab countries for oil, and that's why they're pressuring Israel, maybe that's a part of the marriage between Yishmael and Esav. Today, thank God, there's more sympathy for Israel, but we know Europe and even the United States, you could see Esav suddenly, unfortunately, siding with the other side. So that's what that Barbanel says. So it's just interesting when you look at it that way, and obviously it's on one side it's amusing and humorous, but on the other hand we're dealing with real nefashos here, so we have serious times. But when you understand the inside story, I don't know, for some reason it doesn't make the tzaddis less, but you understand there's a bigger story unfolding here. And it goes all the way back to Avram. Mamish, Avram taught the world, taught his children, Asis Doka Mishpat, we read last week's Parsha. And that's all about bringing the Eibishter to this world. You see, the Rebbe makes such a, especially in the first Maimer, Bas Legani, Vayikra Keil Elam, Vayikra Avram Keil Elam, he made the world recognized as an Eibishter. Avram single-handedly pioneered the whole derech of tzedakah v'chesed, and chesed v'mishpat, tzedakah v'mishpat, and he taught it to his children. But it's not so simple, because as we know, it says in Tanya, it says in many places, we live in a world of a hell and a hester, and even though Avram's teachings are so powerful, but we have a milchama. First of all, the milchama between Yaakov and Esav, Amurim b'Parsha, Yaakov and Esav, and each one of us. The Alter Rebbe brings Lum Yemetz and Perik Tes and Tanya, Nefesh Elikis, Nefesh Abamis. And then the Mulchamas with Yishmael, Shebet Kirbeh. And then, of course, the big Mulchamas out in the world. And that's the story of history. So if you really want to sum it up, it comes down to how do we make peace in this world? Not just between people, between us and the Eibishter. The Eibishter wants Shalom Ba'elam. But he created nations. He created Umas Elam, Sena Esav Yaakov. We have the Hisnagdus of Elam Hazeh to Elam Haba, from Gashmis to Ruchnius. In the case of Yishmael and Yitzchak, the Muhammad Chassidus says, is between Chesed Lumazeh and the need for taming Chesed through Gvura to Kedusha. Yitzchak represents, Chesed without Hakbalas can also destroy. Like if water is not in raindrops, Gvura is Kshamim, it'll destroy the field just like a drought. So Chesed needs to be balanced with Gvura. That's why you have Chesed, Gvura, Teferes. Ishmael was Pera Adam. Yodi Bakel v'yad kel bey. No boundaries. That's what it means, a wild man. There's no boundaries. Yodi Bakel. So the Aveda is that in a person's own life, you have to create a balance between Chesed and Gvura and not allow Chesed just to have no Hagbolas. In the Maimorim of Tofrei Samach Ches and Tovshin Tes, the Rebbe Rashab and the Frierdiker Rebbe explained, the birur is Netzach and Heid. Netzach and Heid is Yishmael and Esav. It doesn't say which is which, I think. Now, what's Netzach and Heid? So in Gedusha Netzach and Heid, in Klippa Netzach and Heid is Midas HaNetzachen, like Per Adam, a Netzachen that's Beli Seichel, and you just fight someone fighting just to fight, just to kill, in a wild way. Heid, I don't know if you know this, but in Islam, one of the Yesodis is surrender. Yeah, Haidah, complete surrender. But again, in a Vilda Eifen, not with Hagbolas. So the Rabbeim write that the birur of Netzach and Heid is the idea of Netzachen de Kedusha, Midas HaNetzachen, like he speaks in Basel Legani. Mavazbus kol ha'etzes, the Midas HaNetzachen, to bring Elikus into this Welt. And Heid is Haidah, Kabbalah Seil. So the more we bring Netzach and Heid in our lives, Kedusha, the more it counters as Mevarer the Netzach Heid of Klippa. So that's the Chassidish so-called take on this. And in practical it means, what the Rebbe said back in during all the Milchamas, that our job is the Ruchnizdika part of the Milchama is the Torah mitzvahs that we do, the air that we add into the world. The more tefillin, mezuzah, stoke, chinuch, especially mepi elim v'yenkim, yasad ta'ez, the hashb'seiv and misnakim, young children, neshek, and all the things. It's interesting, tank. The Rebbe said that the mitzvah tank, which was like the so-called the vehicle that brings in the Mitzrayim to Eden. So in Yud Beis Tammuz Tov Shalom Adala, the Rebbe speaks about tank. And said tank is Rosh Tevis, Taras, Nizik, and Kochim. That's what the Rebbe said. And the Rebbe said, a tank is a wilde Zach. You know, usually you go speak to somebody, you go to their office, you go to their home. Here you go into the street, you park a tank on one of the corners, you call it a tank. A tank is also like a battlefield, it's a war. The Rebbe asked the question. And he answered, in wilde Zeiten darf man haben wilde Mittel. That when things are in wild times and crazy times, you need to do sometimes things that are not just the regular. And what's a tank? The Rebbe said, when do you send a tank? You send a tank when there's barriers and all kinds of blocks and impediments, so the tank can go right through walls, through fences, through all the different barriers that the enemy puts up. The Rebbe said, here, Kemuven, the enemy is Ruchniizdik. So you take a tank, you go lechatchila riber, you call that tank. It's interesting, the Rebbe uses a military example, like Tzivus Hashem. Obviously, Ruchniizdik a military example. Mitzvah tank started right after the Yom Kippur War. That's when the Mivtzoyim and Mitzvah tanks. I remember it also very clearly. I was a bocher in 770. I wasn't in 770, I was still in Ocean Parkway, but I was a bocher then. But you see, all these things are like, you start thinking about the Rebbe, Magdim Raful Lamaka. So now, yes, there are tanks rolling in Gaza. Our job is to bring the Ruchnizdike tanks, to bring Yiddishkeit, the Mivtzoyim to every Yid, and Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Neich to every non-Jew. You also see the sichos of the Rebbe, the mems about Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Neich. The Rebbe said, without it, you have a jungle. Without Ayin Re'ev, Ezen Shamas, the Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Neich. Look around, imagine. You know, I just did last night, yesterday afternoon, I did a podcast with a Muslim. A Muslim. How did he get to me? So I do all these videos. So I did a video last week, which was titled "A Call to My Muslim Cousins and Friends." You know, and my point was a short video that I did, which was about what would Avram Avinu, your grandfather Abraham, what would he say to you now? What would he say when he sees this behavior? So this Muslim reached out to me. He lives in London. He's actually born in Bangladesh. And he reached out and he said that, he sent us some articles, and he is a very pro-Israel. And he also calls his own Muslim friends, calls them out on it. So he suggested maybe we have a conversation. So I did for an hour and 15 minutes. It'll soon be posted. We had this conversation. It was actually very interesting. And he quotes from all his sources. You're not allowed to kill a man, a woman, and a child. I mean, pretty strong stuff. So you see from this, I don't know how many there are like him out there. There may be millions. I don't know what it is. But even if there's one, I'm sure there's more. So I said to him, do you have colleagues that feel like you do? So why don't they speak up? So he told me this, fear, all the different reasons. You can watch the interview, it's a very interesting interview. I'm not giving you, as Kayla and Holler, a license to watch things, but since I see some of you have phones, so I'm sure maybe it's only for chitas, but, right? Okay. Or updates. There's updates. If it's on COL, then it's kosher? Or lav dafka? Huh? Okay, you have to have them both. Yeah. The point being is that I see from my own work, I put out the message there. We have, the Rebbe speaking about Sheva Mitzvahs is not just a nice theory. If every guy understood, every Umas Elam understood, not just the Sheva Mitzvah that was given with Sinai from the Eibishter, and would follow it. It includes everything. There wouldn't be a possibility that a person could attack another person, let alone what happened on Simchas Torah, on October 7th, as it's known. So we have work to be done. You and I and all of us. And the Rebbe laid it all out. As I said, we all hoped such things wouldn't be necessary today, but it seems like that's what the story is. So for us to not act is, in my opinion, a complete unacceptable. The Rebbe would not accept that. The Rebbe turned every Muhammad into a Muhammad Ruchnis that we have to fight it on a Ruchnisdika front. And it's a Muhammad on Tzedek V'Yesher. That's very clear. I can't tell you. I'm sure you've seen some of the videos. How many Eden are in the Seder today? Eden that didn't even think about their Yiddishkeit. Suddenly you need an enemy to wake it up in you. Suddenly you see Nazis. You see Machshamon, what they did. And there's a tremendous Seder for Yiddishkeit. And by Goyim as well. Clear-headed, you see what's good, what's evil. When things are not clear, you have Izbaru V'Slavla Hadvarim right now. Nobody, except the real haters, can say that killing a child, Achmon al-Islam, all the ways they did it, is acceptable. So if they only kill soldiers, Achmon al-Islam, be bad enough. But once you behave in such a way, it's very clear, the Birur Hadvarim here, what's right, what's wrong. We may disagree, but certain things are not acceptable, and that's it, period. I was on another interview, and I said, do you think any Jew went back to Germany after World War II and started killing men, women, and children in Germany? No, that's not the way. Even though we remember what they did, and we're upset, and Hashem Yimkum Dama, etc., etc. But our revenge is through building. We build our families, we build our mezdis, we build generations. But that doesn't mean we forget. There's different ways you fight the war. So bottom line is, the main point that I wanted to bring out is not just time to show the Muslim and a parsha and so on. It comes down to, there's a story unfolding here. It's a story of bringing Elokus into this world. That's our job, Deir HaShvi especially. And you see these things, it's not just a helam. It's all part of something bigger going on. And the end of the day, as the Eibishter told Avram by Bris Ben Absarim, we will prevail, the Dan Notzach, and we Berechush Gadol. The Birur HaUmis is the end of the process. The last Umis are Esav and Yishmael, Edom and Yishmael, and we will prevail as the Rebbe promised us. Igiyaz Man Gulaschem, so it should be Bekarev, the least amount of pain and loss. The Eibishter should protect our holy soldiers who are standing on the front lines, protecting innocent Eden, and Eden everywhere should be protected. And we are soldiers who have to do our job. Sivas Hashem.